Family traditions can be a beautiful thing, binding generations together with shared stories, rituals, and memories. But when my husband first introduced me to his family's heirloom tradition, I quickly realized that not all customs are worth preserving. In fact, some are downright disturbing. It started innocently enough. Our first family gathering after our twins were born was a chaotic, joyful mess of casseroles, mismatched folding chairs, and loud, overlapping conversations. My husband, Ben, comes from a large, close-knit family, the kind where everyone knows everyone else's business, and personal space is a foreign concept. At the time, I found it charming, a warm contrast to my own small, relatively reserved family. As the afternoon wore on and the sun dipped behind the trees, Ben's mother, Margaret, called everyone into the living room. She was a formidable woman in her late 60s, with sharp eyes and a voice that could cut through the noisiest family brawl. When she spoke, people listened. Margaret stood at the center of the room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Beside her, Ben's father, Frank, leaned against the fireplace, his weathered face set in its usual stoic expression. They shared a brief, unreadable glance before Margaret cleared her throat and raised her voice. "All right, everyone, it's time for the heirloom presentation," she announced, her words hanging in the suddenly hushed room. I felt Ben stiffen beside me, his hand tightening around mine. I shot him a questioning look, but he avoided my gaze, his jaw clenched. I made a mental note to ask him about it later, but for the moment, I was more curious than concerned. Margaret reached into a wooden chest beside the fireplace, pulling out a small, ornately carved box. It looked ancient, its dark wood polished to a high sheen, intricate designs etched into its surface. She opened the lid slowly, as if revealing a long-buried treasure, and pulled out a necklace, if you could even call it that. The piece was heavy, a twisted, tangled mass of dark metal links and glistening stones that looked more like polished teeth than gems. It reminded me of something you might find in a medieval torture chamber or a Victorian curio cabinet, the kind of thing that would have been considered macabre even 100 years ago. Margaret held it up for everyone to see, the twisted links clinking together like tiny bones as they caught the flickering firelight. "This," she said, her voice tinged with an almost reverent pride, "is the family heirloom." There was a moment of silence. The room filled only with the crackle of the fire and the faint hum of the ceiling fan. Then, as if on cue, the family erupted into polite applause, the kind you might offer at a child's piano recital or a distant cousin's wedding. I felt a chill creep down my spine as I watched Margaret carefully drape the necklace around her own neck, the dark metal settling against her chest like a set of chains. She smiled, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. "As many of you know," she continued, her voice taking on a solemn, almost ceremonial tone, "this necklace has been passed down through our family for generations. It represents the strength of our bloodline, the sacrifices of those who came before us, and the bond that ties us all together." I glanced around the room, watching as the rest of the family nodded along, their faces set in expressions of solemn approval. Even Ben, who had seemed so tense a moment ago, now wore a faint, wistful smile, his eyes distant as if caught up in some long-forgotten memory. I leaned in, my voice a whisper. "What is this about?" I asked, my heart thudding in my chest. Ben hesitated, his eyes still fixed on the twisted necklace around his mother's neck. "It's just a tradition," he murmured, his voice tight. "Every generation, the necklace is passed down to the next chosen heir. It's a big deal in my family." I frowned, the pieces of the puzzle not quite fitting together in my mind. Chosen heir. What does that even mean? Before he could answer, Margaret's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd once more. "And now," she said, her eyes sweeping the room like a spotlight, "it's time to choose the next heir." I felt my stomach drop, a sudden, inexplicable sense of foreboding settling over me like a dark cloud. Margaret's eyes locked onto mine, her smile widening. "Ben," she said, her voice as sharp as the metal links of the necklace, Why don't you and your lovely wife bring the twins up here? It's time for them to be introduced to the family tradition. I felt Ben's hand tighten around mine, his fingers digging into my skin. He hesitated, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. Mom, I'm not sure that's a good idea, he said, his voice low and strained. They're just babies. Margaret's smile never wavered, her eyes flashing with a sudden, steely resolve. Nonsense, she replied, her tone firm. They're part of this family, and it's time they were properly welcomed. I felt my heart begin to race, my mind spinning with 1,000 unspoken questions. What exactly did this tradition involve? Why was Ben so hesitant, so clearly uncomfortable? And why did I suddenly feel like my children and I had stumbled into something dark and dangerous? A hidden world of secrets and shadows that I had no idea even existed. As I rose to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest, I had the sinking feeling that whatever this heirloom tradition was, it was about to change our lives forever. As I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, I felt the weight of 12 curious, expectant eyes on me. The room, which had felt so warm and welcoming just an hour ago, now seemed heavy, oppressive, the air thick with unspoken tension. Ben hesitated, his face pale and drawn, but after a moment he gently tugged at my hand, leading me toward the front of the room where Margaret still stood, the twisted necklace gleaming darkly against her chest. I glanced down at our twins, cradled in the stroller beside the couch, their tiny faces peaceful and unaware of the storm brewing around them. Margaret's eyes locked onto the stroller as we approached, her smile widening in a way that set my nerves on edge. She leaned down, her thin, wrinkled hands reaching out to stroke the soft, downy hair on our son's head. A beautiful boy and girl, she cooed, her voice suddenly soft, almost reverent. Perfect candidates for the next heirs. I felt my stomach twist at her words. Candidates' heirs. This was starting to feel less like a family tradition and more like some archaic ritual from a forgotten era. Ben cleared his throat, his grip tightening on my hand. Mom, he said, his voice low and strained. They're just babies. They're too young to understand any of this. Margaret straightened, her eyes narrowing slightly as she turned her gaze on her son. Nonsense, she replied, her voice suddenly sharp. They may be young, but they're part of this family, and our traditions matter. You know that. The rest of the family murmured their agreement, a low, rolling wave of approval that sent a fresh chill down my spine. I felt trapped, cornered, like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming truck. Before I could protest, Margaret reached into the wooden chest beside her and pulled out a pair of small, matching metal bands. They were identical in style to the twisted dark necklace around her neck, their surfaces etched with the same intricate, unsettling patterns. She held them out to Ben, her eyes locked on his, the unspoken command clear. For a long, tense moment, Ben hesitated, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. I felt a flare of anger at his silence, the way he seemed so willing to go along with this bizarre charade, even as our children sat vulnerable and exposed at our feet. Finally, he took the bands from his mother's outstretched hands, his fingers trembling slightly. He glanced at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and resignation, then bent down and gently slipped the bands around our twins' tiny wrists. I opened my mouth to protest, to demand an explanation, but before I could get the words out, the room erupted into a loud, jubilant cheer. The family surged forward, clapping and laughing, their faces alight with a strange, feverish excitement. Margaret stepped back, a satisfied smile spreading across her face as she watched the chaotic scene unfold around her. Welcome, she intoned, her voice rising above the din, to the newest members of our family legacy. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat, my heart hammering painfully in my chest as I looked down at my children, their tiny wrists now bound by the cold, dark metal bands. I felt like I had just signed them up for something I didn't understand, something ancient and ominous that I had no idea how to escape from. As the family continued to celebrate around us, Ben leaned in close, his voice a low, desperate whisper. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his eyes never leaving the twisted bands around our children's wrists. "I should have told you. I thought they wouldn't push this so soon." I felt a fresh surge of anger flare up inside me, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. "What is this?" "Ben," I hissed, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. "What have you gotten our children into?" He hesitated, his face pale and drawn, then leaned in even closer, his breath warm against my ear. "It's an old family tradition," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The necklace, the bands, they're symbols of our family's legacy, our history. It's a big deal. It's supposed to bring protection and strength." I pulled back, my eyes narrowing as I searched his face for any sign of the man I had married, the man I had trusted with my life, my heart, my children. "Protection," I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. "Ben, this feels like something out of a gothic horror novel, not a family tradition." He looked away, his jaw tightening as he swallowed hard. "You don't understand," he said, his voice growing more desperate. "This is important to my family. It's bigger than just us." I felt a fresh wave of fear wash over me, my mind racing with 1,000 unspoken questions. What exactly had I married into? What kind of twisted, archaic legacy had my children just been bound to, and most importantly, how was I going to protect them from whatever dark, hidden secrets this family had been guarding for generations? As the night wore on and the family continued to celebrate around us, I felt my resolve harden. I would not let this strange, unsettling tradition consume my children, no matter what it took. But as I glanced down at their tiny, vulnerable faces, their eyes wide and innocent, I felt the cold, heavy weight of the dark metal bands around their wrists like a silent, unbreakable chain, a reminder of just how deeply we had already been ensnared in this twisted family legacy. The days that followed felt like living in a strange, unsettling dream. I couldn't stop thinking about those twisted metal bands, their cold, dark weight around my children's tiny wrists. I had tried to remove them the night we got home, but the clasps wouldn't budge. It was as if they had been welded shut, their dark, intricate designs seeming to twist and shift in the dim light of the nursery as I struggled to pry them off. Ben had stood in the doorway, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and fear as he watched me struggle. "Don't," he had whispered, his voice tight with panic. "You'll only make it worse." I had snapped at him, my voice a harsh, desperate whisper. Worse. How could this possibly get worse? "Ben, what have you done?" He had hesitated, his jaw clenching, then turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the darkened hallway like the tolling of a distant, foreboding bell. That night, as I lay awake in the dark, listening to the soft, rhythmic breaths of our sleeping children through the baby monitor, my mind raced with 1,000 unspoken fears. What had those bands really meant? What kind of legacy had my children just been bound to? Without my knowledge or consent, I had always considered myself a rational, practical person. I didn't believe in curses or dark family secrets, or the kind of gothic horror that seemed to fill the pages of old novels. But as the days dragged on, the unease in the pit of my stomach only grew, my mind replaying Margaret's words over and over like a broken record. They're part of this family, and it's time they were properly welcomed. It wasn't long before strange things began to happen. Small, unsettling coincidences at first. The kind of odd little moments that could easily be dismissed as the products of an overactive imagination. One morning, as I sat in the nursery rocking our daughter back to sleep, I felt a sudden, sharp chill creep over me, the tiny hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I glanced down at her, my heart skipping a beat as I noticed the twisted metal band around her wrist glinting in the morning sunlight, its dark surface seeming to pulse and flicker like a living thing. A few days later, our son, who had always been a quiet, peaceful sleeper, suddenly began waking in the middle of the night, his small, chubby fists flailing as he wailed at the top of his lungs, his eyes wide and unfocused, as if he had seen something terrifying lurking in the shadows of his crib. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that it was just a phase, that all babies had nightmares. But deep down, I felt the cold, creeping certainty that something was terribly, horribly wrong. It all came to a head one night, about a week after the heirloom ceremony. I had just settled into bed, the warm, comforting weight of my blankets, a welcome contrast to the cold, unsettling darkness that seemed to fill the rest of the house, when I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping from the nursery. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to make out the sound, my mind racing with 1,000 horrible possibilities. Tap, tap, tap. The sound grew louder, more insistent, each tap sending a fresh jolt of fear through my already frayed nerves. I threw off the covers and stumbled down the hallway, my bare feet slapping against the cold, polished wood floors as I reached the nursery door. I hesitated for a moment, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob, then pushed it open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint, silvery glow of the nightlight in the corner. My heart skipped a beat as I took in the scene before me. Both of my children were standing in their cribs, their tiny hands gripping the rails as they stared at the door, their eyes wide and unblinking, their heads tilted at identical, unnatural angles. The twisted metal bands around their wrists glinted in the faint light, their dark, twisted surfaces seeming to pulse and flicker like tiny, malevolent hearts. I took a shaky step into the room, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as I reached for my daughter, my trembling hands closing around her tiny, warm body. "It's okay, baby," I whispered, my voice shaking as I pulled her close, her tiny body warm and solid against my chest. "Mommy's here." But as I glanced down, my heart nearly stopped in my chest. The twisted metal band around her wrist was glowing, its dark surface pulsing with a dull, angry light, the intricate, swirling design seeming to shift and writhe like a nest of angry, coiled snakes. I stumbled back, nearly dropping her as I reached for my son, pulling him into my arms and backing slowly toward the door. My mind was a swirling, chaotic mess of fear and confusion, my heart racing as I stumbled back down the hallway. My children clutched tightly against my chest. As I reached the bedroom, I kicked the door shut behind me, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as I collapsed onto the bed, my children still clinging to me, their tiny bodies warm and solid against my own. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of anger and betrayal, my mind flashing back to Ben's haunted, guilty expression as he had slipped those bands around our children's wrists, his whispered warnings still echoing in my ears. I had trusted him. I had married him. I had built a life with him, given him my heart, my children, my everything. And now, I realized with a sickening jolt of clarity, he had betrayed me in the worst possible way. This wasn't just a family tradition. It was a curse, a dark, twisted legacy that had already sunk its claws deep into our lives, its cold, unbreakable chains wrapped tightly around my children's innocent, vulnerable souls. And as I sat there, my children still clinging to me, their tiny hearts beating in time with my own, I knew that I had to find a way to break free, to protect them from whatever dark, hidden evil their father's family had bound them to, no matter what it took. In the days that followed, I felt like I was living in a nightmare, each moment tinged with a rising, choking sense of dread. My once cozy, sunlit home had become a place of shadows and whispers, its corners filled with the echo of creaking floorboards and the soft, rhythmic clinking of metal against flesh. The twisted metal bands around my children's wrists had taken on an almost hypnotic presence in my mind, their dark, gleaming surfaces seeming to pulse and flicker with a life of their own, even in the bright morning light. I had tried to ignore it, to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew better. Ben had become increasingly withdrawn, his once warm, easy smile replaced by a tight, haunted expression that only deepened the longer I pressed him for answers. He had taken to locking himself in his office for hours at a time, his voice a low, frantic murmur as he muttered into his phone, his words too muffled to make out through the thick wooden door. I had tried to confront him, to demand an explanation, but every time I pushed, he would shut down, his face going pale as he stumbled over half-hearted reassurances and vague, evasive excuses. Finally, one afternoon, as I sat on the porch watching the twins play in the backyard, their tiny, chubby legs wobbling as they toddled through the freshly cut grass, I reached my breaking point. I couldn't keep living like this. Couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay when every instinct in my body was screaming at me that it wasn't. I waited until Ben came home that evening, his shoulders slumped, his eyes ringed with dark, sleepless circles. I cornered him in the kitchen, my hands shaking as I closed the door behind me, blocking his path to the hallway. "Ben," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger, "you need to tell me what's going on. Now." He hesitated, his eyes darting to the door, as if weighing his chances of escape, but then he caught the look in my eyes. The raw, desperate determination that I knew was etched across my face, and he seemed to crumble, his shoulders sagging as he leaned back against the counter. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. It's not something I can just explain." I felt a fresh wave of anger flare up inside me, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. "Try," I snapped, my voice a harsh, desperate whisper. "Because I'm not letting this go, not anymore." He closed his eyes, his jaw tightening as he took a deep, shuddering breath. "It's the family legacy," he murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The bands, the necklace. They're more than just heirlooms. They're part of a pact, an ancient tradition that goes back generations." I felt my blood run cold, my mind racing as I struggled to process his words. A pact, I repeated, my voice shaking. "Ben, what are you talking about?" He opened his eyes, his gaze filled with a haunted, desperate sort of resignation. It's a bond," he said, his voice trembling. "A way to bind the family together, to protect our bloodline, to ensure our legacy. But it comes with a cost." I felt my stomach twist into a tight, painful knot, my heart hammering painfully in my chest. "A cost," I repeated, my mind flashing back to the strange, pulsing glow of the bands around my children's wrists, the way they had stared at me with those wide, unblinking eyes in the darkness of the nursery. "What kind of cost?" Ben, he looked away, his face pale and drawn, his hands trembling as he reached up to run his fingers through his hair. "The bands. They're not just symbols," he whispered, his voice cracking. They're conduits. They bind the wearer to the family, to the legacy, to the will of the ancestors." I felt a cold, sinking sensation settle in the pit of my stomach, my mind racing with 1,000 unspoken questions. "Ben, what have you done?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "What have you bound our children to?" He looked back at me, his eyes filled with a raw, desperate sort of guilt that cut me to my core. "I didn't have a choice," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's been passed down through my family for generations. It's a curse, a binding. Once the bands are placed, they can't be removed, not without consequences." I stumbled back, my mind reeling as his words echoed in my ears. A curse, a binding, consequences. I felt a fresh wave of panic rise in my throat, my mind flashing back to that night in the nursery, the twisted metal bands glowing in the darkness, their dark, intricate designs seeming to pulse and flicker like tiny, malevolent hearts. I took a deep, shuddering breath, my hands clenching into fists at my sides as I forced myself to meet his gaze. "Then we break it," I whispered, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. "Whatever it takes. We break this curse. We break this legacy. For our children." He hesitated, his eyes filling with a fresh wave of fear as he reached for my hand, his fingers cold and trembling against my own. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Once the bond is made, it can't be broken. Not without blood." I felt my heart skip a beat, my mind racing as his words settled over me like a dark, suffocating fog. Blood. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as I turned and fled the room, my mind a chaotic, swirling mess of fear and confusion. I didn't stop running until I reached the nursery, my hands shaking as I pulled my children into my arms, their tiny, warm bodies a comforting, grounding weight against my chest. I felt a fresh wave of determination rise within me, my heart pounding in my chest as I clutched my children close, my mind racing with a single, desperate thought. I would not let this twisted, dark legacy consume my family. I would find a way to break the curse, to sever the bonds that had already begun to tighten around my children's innocent, vulnerable souls. No matter what it took. Wind down. As I sat there, my children clinging to me in the darkness, their tiny, rhythmic breaths a comforting contrast to the chaos swirling in my mind, I felt a sudden, calming certainty settle over me. I would find a way to break this curse, to shatter the twisted, ancient chains that had bound my family for generations. And in that moment, as I held my children close and whispered soft, soothing words into the darkness, I felt the first faint stirrings of hope, a fragile, flickering light in the darkness that I knew, somehow, I would cling to, no matter what the future held.